They never tell you how long you've got before something goes wrong. They just say, keep breathing and watch your levels. What they don't say is that it's not just the water pressure trying to kill you. It's the dark, the cold, the isolation. All those things add up and eventually they get inside your head. Then you start making mistakes. And in my line of work, mistakes are deadly. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I've been diving for over a decade and I'm still alive. Some call it skill, others call it luck. Me, I think it's because I know how to shut everything out. The fear, the doubt, the little voice in your head telling you something's wrong. You learn to ignore all that if you want to make it back to the surface. The call came in at 2 a.m. A cargo ship, Zephyr Horizon, went off radar somewhere in the North Atlantic. Last known coordinates put it near the Reykjanes Ridge, right on the edge of an uncharted trench. Normally that wouldn't be our problem. Ships go missing all the time, but this one was different. High-value cargo, military contract, no distress signal, just gone. The salvage mission wasn't my first. Hell, it wasn't even my 10th. I've been pulled into ops like this more times than I can count. But the difference this time was the location. That trench. It wasn't the depth that bothered me. It was the unknown. Something about it didn't sit right. The dive was routine at first. We boarded the Resolute, a retrofitted deep-sea salvage vessel. The kind that looks like a floating bucket, but has more tech crammed inside it than a space shuttle. They'd outfitted us with the latest pressure suits, self-contained rebreathers, and a submersible drone. They'd even brought along a mini-sub for the recovery. I glanced over at Anders, my second on the dive, tall, lanky, and always chewing on the end of a toothpick. He'd been diving for years too, but I could tell he didn't like this mission. He'd been quiet during the briefing, more so than usual. "Feel like sharing?" I asked as we suited up. Anders spat the toothpick into the bin and wiped his mouth with the back of his glove. "Something's wrong, man. The trench, we've got no data on it, no bathymetry, just blind guesses about the depth." I adjusted the straps on my suit. "We've done worse." "Not like this," he muttered. Maybe he was right. But if there's one thing I'd learned, it's that you don't question the mission. You focus on the job. Anything else gets you killed. The Resolute reached the drop zone just before dawn, though it didn't matter. We weren't going to see sunlight where we were headed. The water was calm, a glassy black sheet stretching out to the horizon. But that was just the surface. Underneath, it was chaos. 10 minutes to drop," the captain's voice came through the intercom. "Final checks, boys." I ran through the checklist. Suit pressure, good. Rebreather functioning, check. Communications link, stable. Everything looked perfect. No surprises. I liked it that way. Anders stepped up beside me, checking his own equipment. "You know, it's always the missions that look perfect where things go sideways." "Good thing I'm not superstitious," I said, but there was no humor in my voice. He was right. We both knew it. The descent into the trench was unlike anything I'd experienced. The water pressed in on us from all sides, an invisible weight that increased with every meter. It didn't take long for the light from the surface to vanish, leaving only the beams from our helmets to cut through the blackness. I kept my breathing slow and steady, in rhythm with the soft exhale of the rebreather. The pressure on my chest was like a vice, but I'd gotten used to it over the years. After the first 500 meters, Anders broke the silence. "You seeing this?" I glanced at my display. His telemetry was fine. "What are you talking about?" "Sonar's acting weird, picking up something big down there." We knew there was a ridge. "Nah, this ain't the ridge. It's something else." I checked my own readouts. Sure enough, there was a blip on the sonar, a large object, stationary, about 200 meters below us. Too big to be the wreck of the Zephyr Horizon, but definitely not a natural formation either. "Maybe a subsea rock slide?" "Sure," Anders muttered, though I could tell he didn't believe that. Neither did I. We continued our descent, the drone leading the way, its camera feed streaming back to our helmets. The trench walls rose up on either side, rough rock formations resembling the ribs of a long-dead creature rather than geological features. The water was thick with sediment, stirred up by currents from deeper below. It created a haze that made it hard to see more than a few meters ahead. At 800 meters, the blip on the sonar became clearer. It wasn't just big, it was enormous. A structure made of something that reflected the sonar waves in sharp lines. The kind of reflection that metal gives, or something even harder. But what was metal doing this far down and in this quantity? "Anders, you getting this?" "Yeah," he replied. "That's not the ship, that's something else. We weren't prepared for this. The mission was supposed to be a salvage, not an exploration. But here we were, staring at what looked like a massive, submerged building, sitting at the bottom of the trench like it had been there for centuries. The Zephyr horizon was supposed to be nearby, but now that seemed like the least of our problems. I signaled to the drone, directing it closer to the structure. The feed showed walls made of a dark, smooth material, not stone, but something harder, something artificial. The walls rose up into the darkness, disappearing into the sediment above. They were covered in strange markings, not like any script I'd seen, more like deep grooves cut into the surface. "This thing's huge," Anders whispered. "How the hell did no one know about it?" "Focus on the job. We find the voyage data recorder and get back to the surface." But I couldn't tear my eyes from the feed. Whatever this was, it wasn't supposed to be here, and we weren't supposed to find it. At 1,000 meters, the pressure was immense. My suit creaked as the water tried to crush it, and I had to fight the instinct to turn back. Just like training, just keep breathing, keep your head. But the silence, the blackness, the isolation, they were getting to me. Then, the feed from the drone glitched. For a second, the structure disappeared, replaced by static. Then it came back, but something had changed. The markings on the wall seemed to shift as if they were moving. "Anders, do you see that?" He didn't respond. I glanced at my comms readout. Anders' signal was weak. The drone's feed stuttered again. Then it went dead. I tapped my helmet comms, speaking slowly, like it might help the signal cut through the water. "Anders, copy? What's your status?" Nothing but static. The comm line sputtered like a dying radio, providing only faint pops of distortion. The silence of the deep wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating, surrounding me from every direction. You start wondering what's just outside your light's reach, waiting for you to turn your back. I took a slow breath, forcing calm. There was nothing else down here but me. That's what I told myself. Just the structure and the wreck we were supposed to salvage. I flicked the control for the drone, but it was still dead. No response. The sonar was useless now too. All I had left was the suit's flashlight and a gut feeling that things were about to go very wrong. The thing that looked like a building was still ahead, extending beyond the reach of my lights. My first thought was that it had to be some kind of military installation, hidden deep under the ocean for God knows how long. But the deeper I looked, the less sense that made. The material, it wasn't metal or concrete, it was some kind of composite, smoother than anything I'd seen before. Parts of it were almost polished, but not by human hands. The whole thing had a weird geometry that made my head hurt if I stared too long. I kept close to the wall, following it slowly. My boots crunched against the fine silt coating the ocean floor, stirring up faint clouds with every step. The trench seemed to swallow all sound, muting even the thud of my boots. Occasionally, small creatures darted through the darkness. Translucent fish, eels, things I couldn't identify. I scanned the structure again, trying to spot any breaks in the surface, something resembling an entrance. Anders was probably further down by now, and the VDR, our actual mission, could have been anywhere. And then I saw a crack in the wall. I don't know why I hadn't noticed it before. It wasn't natural, not some random fracture caused by the pressure. It was an opening, wide enough for me to squeeze through. The surface around it was smooth, as if the crack had been sealed shut for a long time. I moved closer, shining my light into the narrow gap, but the beam only went so far before it got swallowed up by darkness. I paused. This wasn't the mission. We weren't here to explore unknown ruins. We were supposed to retrieve the ship's voyage data recorder and get out. But there was something about this place. Something that pulled at me. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to stay outside, to keep moving along the wall and find the wreckage. The other part, the part that was always curious, nudged me forward. It took a few tries to wedge myself through the crack. My suit scraped against the walls, and for a second I was stuck. But then I popped through, into the structure. Inside, everything was weird. The walls weren't flat, not like I expected. They sloped inward at odd angles, curving in ways that made no architectural sense. The material was polished, almost reflective in places, despite being God knows how old. I adjusted my flashlight, sweeping the beam over the carvings on the walls. It took me a second to realize they weren't carvings. They were grooves, deep cuts etched into the surface, twisting in on themselves, overlapping and intersecting in ways that felt deliberate. There was no pattern I could understand, no language I could recognize, but it all seemed too precise to be random. I kept moving further in, trying not to let my imagination get the best of me. The corridor continued endlessly, the walls sloping and bending. It didn't feel like I was walking through a building anymore. It felt more like the thing was breathing around me, shifting with every step. I checked the oxygen level in my tank. Still had time, but it was running lower than I would have liked. I needed to get out of here. But as I stood up, something moved at the edge of my light. A shadow, like it was part of the water itself, just beyond where the beam could reach. I stared at the spot, focusing, trying to convince myself it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. But the shadow didn't fade. It stayed, shifting slightly. That feeling came back, the one every diver knows too well. That instinct telling you something is wrong. Really wrong. I backed away slowly, keeping my light trained on the shadow, but it stayed just beyond reach, like it was waiting for something. My pulse quickened. I kept moving backward, feeling the wall press against my back. Then it moved, fast. It darted forward, slipping into the light for just a second. That was all I needed to see it. It wasn't a shadow. The thing that slid into view was barely distinguishable from the surrounding water at first, like it was part of the ocean itself. Its surface was smooth and dark, shifting in waves, not quite liquid but not solid either. It moved without any discernible limbs, a mass of seamless, rippling matter. There were no eyes, no features, just a texture that shifted under my light, absorbing it, bending it in ways that made the edges of its form impossible to define. It wasn't swimming. It wasn't even moving like a creature from our world should. It was there, and then it wasn't, its form coming in and out of the light's reach, as though it wasn't fully bound to this space. It didn't need a face. It didn't need anything familiar. The longer I stared, the more I realized it wasn't meant to be understood. I stumbled back, slamming into the wall. The thing moved closer, gliding through the water like it didn't belong in this world. My breathing quickened, and I could hear the rush of blood in my ears, drowning out everything else. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. It didn't swim away, it just disappeared, like it had melted back into the water. I stood there, heart hammering, my light sweeping the area in frantic movements. Nothing, no trace of it. I had to get out. I turned, moving back toward the crack in the wall, but the layout had changed. The opening I'd squeezed through wasn't where it had been. The walls were different now, the angles sharper, more confusing. My head spun and I blinked hard, trying to shake off the disorientation. Where was the exit? How had I lost it so quickly? I retraced my steps, but it felt like I was walking in circles. Every direction I turned looked the same, smooth walls, endless grooves. From deep within the structure, I felt a tremor. Not mechanical, but almost organic. The material under my gloves vibrated subtly, like it was alive with something stirring below. It wasn't sound exactly, more like a pulse, an unseen rhythm that throbbed through the ground beneath me, syncing with my heartbeat. The sensation crept up through my boots, into my bones. It was awake. I wasn't alone anymore. The layout of the place had changed. I was sure of it. It wasn't disorientation or panic. The angles were sharper, more disjointed. I pressed my gloved hand against the nearest wall and felt that same tremor under my palm, as if I was touching the surface of something living, breathing. I scanned the corridor, the light from my helmet cutting through the dark like a knife. The walls seemed to ripple at the edges of the beam, but I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the water or if they were actually moving. "Anders!" I said again, more to keep myself grounded than anything else. My voice sounded hollow in my ears, swallowed by the suit. The only thing more suffocating than the silence was the thought that he might already be gone. The walls around me curved in ways that didn't make sense, like the structure was designed by something that didn't understand the basic principles of architecture. Or perhaps something that did, but had no need for them. Every few steps, I tapped my helmet comms, calling out to Anders, but the static on the other end didn't change. Then, ahead of me, something caught my eye. A faint glimmer at the edge of my light. It wasn't a reflection from the walls. It was metallic, sharp, out of place in this environment. I moved toward it slowly, careful not to let my imagination get the better of me. As I neared, I realized what it was, a piece of diving equipment. The name scratched into the side of the oxygen tank was unfamiliar, James Bennett. The realization hit me. There was someone else down here, or at least there had been. I crouched next to the equipment, examining it in the narrow beam of my light. It was old, much older than it should have been. The metal was pitted and worn, crusted over with a layer of silt and marine life. It didn't belong to any of us. Whoever James Bennett was, he'd been down here long before our mission had even started. The tank looked like it had been here for years, maybe even decades. But that wasn't possible. This trench had never been charted, let alone explored. How could there have been another diver down here, one that no one knew about? And where was the rest of him? My breathing quickened, the sound of air cycling through my rebreather louder now in my ears. I stood up, backing away from the tank. There was a growing pressure in my chest, a tightness that had nothing to do with the depth. I was suddenly hyper-aware of how deep we were, how alone we were. I glanced around, trying to make sense of it, trying to see where this forgotten diver might have gone. But all I saw were the walls, still shifting, still moving. As I moved further down the corridor, I became more aware of the patterns carved into the walls, grooves that hadn't been there when I'd first entered. They spiraled outward, intersecting at sharp angles, forming intricate designs that seemed to twist in on themselves the longer I looked at them. I stopped walking, the realization finally hitting me. I wasn't inside a building. This wasn't a structure made by humans. This place was alive, and it was waking up. I turned sharply, trying to retrace my steps, but the corridor had changed again. The walls closed in on me, narrowing to the point where I had to squeeze through the gaps. It felt like I was moving deeper, even though I was trying to head back toward the entrance. Every time I turned, another passageway seemed to appear, leading me further inside. My comms crackled suddenly and my heart jumped. "Anders?" I called out, desperate for a response. "Anders, do you copy?" More static, but this time through the crackling noise I heard a voice, distant, like it was coming from miles away. "Help me." I froze. The voice wasn't Anders's. It wasn't even human. It was garbled, distorted, a rasp that barely registered as speech. I tried to comprehend what I had just heard, tried to convince myself that it was just interference. But deep down, I knew better. There was something else in here with me. I started moving again, faster now, the panic bubbling up in my throat. My mind was spiraling, flashing through every training scenario, every emergency procedure I'd ever learned, but none of it was enough to push down the growing sense of dread. The corridor ahead widened abruptly, opening into a larger space. I stopped at the entrance, shining my light into the darkness. The walls here were smoother, less chaotic than the passages I had just come through. The grooves were still there, spiraling into a central point at the far end. And there, in the middle, was something else. I didn't want to move closer, but my legs carried me forward almost against my will, drawn by some invisible force. As I stepped into the space, the pulse beneath the floor intensified, rattling through my bones. The object in the center was hard to make out at first. It was covered in silt, partially buried in the floor. But as I approached, I could see it more clearly. It was a slab, a smooth, flat surface made of the same material as the walls. And on the surface of the slab were remains. The skeleton was human, or at least it had been at one point, but the bones were warped in ways that didn't make sense. The ribcage was misshapen, the limbs angled strangely, the skull crushed inward. It wasn't the pressure of the ocean that had done this. Something else had changed this body, reshaped it. I stared down at the remains. There was something carved into the slab beneath the skeleton, more of the grooves and spirals, but they were deeper here. The bones had been arranged intentionally, placed inside the pattern like they were part of some ancient ritual. Whoever this person had been, whatever had happened to them, it wasn't an accident. This was intentional. I staggered back, catching myself against the slick wall. It felt like the structure was reacting to me, tightening around me like a predator waiting for its prey to tire before striking. Then, all at once, it hit me. A flood of images, sounds, sensations that weren't my own. My knees buckled and I collapsed against the wall. My vision darkened, and in an instant, I was somewhere else. I was inside the helmet of another diver, one who had been here long before I ever set foot in this place. His breaths came uneven, his body shaking as he stared at the same walls. The name on his suit was visible for only a moment. James Bennett. I could feel his fear, his desperation, as if it were my own. His thoughts bled into mine, a frantic, spiraling loop of panic. He was lost, trapped in the same corridors that I was. The structure had taken him, just as it was trying to take me now. He moved forward, his light cutting through the murky water ahead, illuminating more of the same spiraling patterns on the walls. He was calling out, his voice desperate, pleading, but there was no answer. Only the silence of the deep. Just as he reached the end of a corridor, he saw the same place I had found. The slab, the bones. He recoiled, pulling back, but it was too late. Bennett clutched his head as the pressure inside his helmet became unbearable. He screamed, but no sound escaped in the crushing silence of the deep. His breathing became frantic, shallow, and the suit felt like it was tightening around him with each panicked breath, suffocating him from the inside. I felt his terror as though it was my own. He tried to retreat, but the structure closed in around him. The walls shifted, bending in on themselves, blocking his escape. He turned, desperate to find another way out, but every passage he tried led back to the same place, to the slab, to the bones. He couldn't escape. It wouldn't let him. He dropped to his knees, clutching at his helmet, screaming again and again, his voice lost to the crushing silence of the deep. His hands moved to his chest, clawing at the suit, trying to rip it open, as if the suit was suffocating him. His vision darkened and then, with a jolt, his body twisted. The suit, his body, began to warp, the fabric stretching, his limbs bending, his ribs cracked, his skull caved in, and still, he screamed. The last thing I felt was his agony. Then, everything went black. I snapped back to myself with a violent jolt, my hands instinctively grabbing at my own helmet as if I too were being suffocated. My vision cleared, but the room was still spinning. I could feel the same fear that had consumed Bennett, the same terror that had driven him to madness. But I wasn't going to die like that. Whatever had taken him, whatever had twisted him into that broken husk, it wasn't finished. It was still here, still waiting. I stumbled forward, trying to find my way out, trying to remember which way I had come in. But the corridors were different now. The walls had shifted again, closing in tighter, blocking off every route of escape. My head swam, disoriented, the images of Bennett's final moments still flashing in the corners of my vision. I could see it. The way his body had broken, the way the structure had consumed him. It wanted the same from me. My comms emitted a static noise, snapping me out of the spiral of fear. For a second, I thought it might be Anders, but the voice that followed wasn't his. "Help me!" The voice was weak, distorted. It was Bennett. His voice was hollow and strained, like it was coming from somewhere far, far away. There was no way it could be real. He was dead. I'd seen his death. But the voice continued, pleading, desperate. "They took me. Don't let it." It cut out, replaced by the dull noise of static. Was this place doing the same thing to me that it had done to Bennett? Was I losing my grip on reality? I didn't know. I couldn't know. All I knew was that I had to move. I had to get out. I pushed forward, deeper into the corridors, my light cutting through the murky water. Another flash of memory hit me, another victim. This time it wasn't Bennett. It was a woman, her face contorted in terror, her suit collapsing under the pressure as the structure twisted her body beyond recognition. She was screaming, but it was soundless, her mouth wide, her eyes filled with agony. The memories weren't mine, but they were being forced into my mind, crowding out my own thoughts, my own will. I could see their faces, the other divers who had come here, who had been consumed by this place. I could hear their voices, their final pleas, their terror. I shoved the thoughts aside, gritting my teeth as I pushed forward. The corridor ahead curved, leading me deeper into the structure. I had no idea where I was going, no sense of direction, but I didn't care. I just had to move. The corridors folded in on themselves like living things, walls narrowing as if they were trying to close me in. My breathing was shallow, each inhale a battle as the suit felt tighter by the second. The visions, the faces of the dead, Bennett, the others, they crowded my mind, consuming what was left of my sanity. But I knew this wasn't real, at least not in the way I was experiencing it. The structure, whatever it was doing this to me. It was messing with my mind, clouding my thoughts, warping my senses. It wanted me confused, disoriented. That's how it had taken the others, feeding on their fear, bending them until they broke. I couldn't let it break me. I needed to focus, needed to remind myself of the real things. The suit was real, my body was real, the pressure around me was real. And if I kept my head, if I focused on what I knew was true, I could fight it. "Stay grounded," I muttered under my breath. "Remember your training." I pulled at memories of all the dives before this one. Dives where things had gone wrong, where panic had encroached upon my thoughts. But I'd survived by focusing on the practical. Step by step, detail by detail. I broke the situation down into pieces, smaller, manageable actions. What's real? The suit, the oxygen, the pressure gauges. I checked them again. Oxygen levels steady, suit integrity intact. That was reality. Everything else, the warping walls, the whispers, the visions of the dead, they were lies, the structure's tricks. It wanted me to doubt myself, to lose control, but I wouldn't let it. I opened my eyes. The walls weren't shifting now. They were still, just as they had been when I first stepped into this nightmare. The carvings, the symbols, none of them were moving anymore. The tremors were there, but weaker, like the structure was losing its grip on me. I could think clearly now, without the constant barrage of fear and confusion. I was still deep within the structure, and the exit was nowhere in sight. But that didn't matter. I wasn't lost. This place wasn't going to beat me. It couldn't, because I knew its game now. I moved forward, ignoring the flashes of the dead. They were remnants, fragments of what the structure had thrown at me. But they were fading now, becoming weaker with each step I took. Finally, ahead of me was an opening, not the same crack I had come through, but close enough. I pushed through the gap, the suit rubbing against the narrow space. The moment I was through, I felt lighter, the pressure easing off slightly. I was still deep, far deeper than any human had business being, but I was no longer trapped in the belly of that thing. My comms activated. "This is the Resolute, do you copy?" I fumbled for my transmitter, heart racing as I fought to suppress the panic. "This is Diver 1. I'm clear of the structure. Do you copy?" The static hissed for a moment, then a burst of relief hit me as the reply came through. "We've got you, Diver 1. Signal's weak, but we've got you. Are you ready for extraction?" "Ready?" I breathed, not able to believe the word as it left my mouth. "Get me the hell out of here." The extraction was slow, agonizingly so. I felt the tension in the tether pulling me up, inch by inch, as the winch on the mini-sub reeled me in. I stayed completely still, focusing on my breathing, letting the faint pull of the current wash over me as I ascended. Eventually, I saw the faint lights of the sub overhead. The mechanical arm reached down, securing me with a harness as it began the long haul to the surface. The pressure lessened incrementally as I was pulled upward, the crushing weight on my chest easing. I finally broke the surface and they hauled me onto the Resolute. I was out. I was alive. A flurry of questions followed. What had happened down there? Where was Anders? What the hell was that thing at the bottom of the trench? I didn't have answers. I didn't want answers. All I knew was that I had survived, and Anders hadn't. His signal had cut out completely, lost somewhere in that maze of shifting corridors. The rest of the team, the crew on the surface, looked at me with relief. And something else. Fear, maybe. They could tell something had changed down there, something I couldn't explain. I didn't give them the details. How could I explain the way the structure had burrowed into my mind, twisted my senses, broken me down until I wasn't sure what was real and what was just its influence? How could I tell them that even now, out in the open air, I could still feel the pulse, like an itch in the back of my skull? I was debriefed for hours, going over the technical details of the dive, the failure of the equipment, the loss of Anders. The higher-ups would send another team, no doubt, to explore the trench again, to recover the VDR we'd never found, or to retrieve whatever remains of the structure they could. But I knew better. Whatever was down there, whatever had built that thing, it wasn't meant to be found. It was old, ancient, and far more dangerous than anyone realized. I stayed silent about Bennett and the others, the visions of those who had come before me. Their faces haunted me still, flashes of bones and broken bodies carved into my memory. I could sense the burden of their final moments hanging over me, but I wasn't going to let that place take any more from me. It had already claimed enough. Weeks later, after I'd been cleared for duty again, I still couldn't sleep without seeing the structure, how it had almost drawn me in. I could still feel the tremor in my bones, even though I was miles away from that trench. But I was free of it now. At least, that's what I told myself. There were rumors after that, whispers among the crew about the mission, about what really happened down there, about how Anders wasn't the only one who had gone missing near that trench over the years. I didn't care. Let them wonder, let them speculate. I knew the truth, and I wasn't going back.